Today is July 8th, 2025, and my guest is author and educational entrepreneur Doug Lemov, the Chief Knowledge Officer of Teach Like a Champion, an organization that does professional development for teachers and writes curricula for them. This is Doug's third appearance on the program. He was last year in November of 2016 talking about reading. We're going to talk about reading again today, specifically based on his new book, co-authored with Colleen Driggs and Erica Woolway, The Teach Like a Champion Guide to the Science of Reading. Doug, welcome back to EconTalk.
Good to see you, Russ. Thanks for having me.
This is a handbook for teachers, but it also has deep lessons for anyone who reads, for parents of children who are readers. And I want to start off with how you start off in the book with what went wrong with reading in America, the teaching of reading in America in recent years, and the reporting of Emily Hanford, an investigative journalist who did a podcast on this topic, and we will link to that. What did she uncover?
Yeah, it's tragic what she uncovered. I would describe her work as the most important piece of education journalism in the 21st century. What she discovered is that early reading programs in American schools, so this is when students learn to read, the most popular programs have been based more on ideology than on science. And we have learned a lot about the science of how people learn to read. And they really ignored science that was out there. It was it was available to them. And for a variety of reasons that we can get into, the most popular early reading programs, instead of teaching students systematic synthetic phonics, how to decode words, what sounds mean, went with a more whole language approach. They often socialized students to guess at words that made sense or what the picture said. And the result is that many students, millions of students, sadly, did not learn to read. Emily's podcast described this in excruciating detail. It was something like the 5th most downloaded podcast in the U.S. in 2023. And one of the results was something like 20 states passed legislation that early reading programs had to be founded in science. And so it really created an incredible amount of change. But unfortunately, it really came 20 years too late. That this is research that we did know for 20 years before the required change happened.
Why? You just said it was many programs were based on whole language. What does that mean?
Yeah. So there were two arguments about how you learn to read. One was, frankly, much more compelling if I'm a teacher, which is if I introduce students to words and books and ask them to read, they will learn to read relatively naturally if I encourage them and foster them and I expose them to a lot of print. That's the kind of whole language approach. And the alternative to it is something called phonics or systematic synthetic phonics, which argues that the way to teach students to read is to teach them deliberately letter sounds, combinations of letter sounds, how they work, have them practice them. It's a lot of flashcards. But it means that when they come across a word that they don't know, they can sound it out. And the science is overwhelmingly, many students will learn to read naturally, but many students won't. Doesn't have to do much with their intelligence. It's just, some kids crack the code on their own through exposure, but some kids don't. And so the idea is behind systematic synthetic phonics is that we intentionally teach the code of letter sound correspondence. One of the problems with it is that it can be repetitive. It requires a lot of flashcards and repetition,
drilling.
And that does not always jibe with what teachers imagine themselves doing when they take the job. Strangely, I think actually students love phonics activities when they're done well, but it wasn't what adults imagined, and so. Teachers were, perhaps for that reason, more receptive to arguments that phonics was either unnecessary or painful or miserable, and it really lost the day. And a more whole language type approach dominated for 20 years. And the result is that millions of kids did not learn to read, or learn to read suboptimally, or finally learn to read way too late, and associated reading with with unpleasantness. The costs, as Emily Hanford described, were dizzying. Not just for families and for kids, but also for teachers who spent their professional lives teaching the single most important thing that we do in schools wrong. And that's a painful thing to reckon with.
I want to talk about another example of, I consider these things educational fads that run through educational departments in graduate schools of education. There are many, many reasons for why fads take root. Some are simple, that it's fun to have a new thing, and maybe it's the better thing, and so we grab it and try it. Sometimes it's ideological. It might align with some other theory of society or human beings that people hold. But sometimes there's just some romance about it that we hope is true that isn't. And I want to quote Dylan William. You say, you quote him saying, quote, "The big mistake we have made in the United States is to assume that if we want students to be able to think, then our curriculum should give our students lots of practice thinking. This is a mistake because what our students need is more to think with." And, that idea that if you want to be able to think, you should practice thinking. And later we'll talk about, if you want to get good at vocabulary, you should practice acquiring vocabulary. That's a very reasonable idea, and it speaks, as you point out in the book, to a utopian ideal that we want to believe about education. So talk about that romance, and why is it wrong? It seems like, what could be wrong with that? If you want to learn how to do something, you practice it.
Mark Seidenberg has this really powerful quote that I cite in the book also. He says, reading is a complex skill that intuition cannot easily penetrate. One more quote, and then I'll be done. Daniel Willingham says, we've learned more about the cognitive science, about how people learn in the last 25 years than we did in the previous 2,500 combined. That we have been a profession that has been forced by lack of science to fall back on logic and intuition and compelling arguments and ideology. And so that's our habit. What seems compelling, what seems like it makes sense, is how things should work. I read an exchange that happened on the internet. Someone was talking about teaching reading, and a professor of education emeritus opined that teaching reading explicitly is silly. If you look at how students learn to speak, they learn to speak naturally. Everyone learns to speak. This is how reading happens also. And that is a very logical argument, but it's profoundly unscientific, because we've been speaking for 250,000 years. And so our brains have evolved to speak, right? And there are parts of your brain, Broca's area, Wernicke's area, that are designed for language acquisition. And so a baby left to its own devices will begin to mimic and copy its parents, and it will, barring, cognitive or perceptive problems, a baby will learn to speak on its own. But we've been reading for 5,000 years. And for most of that time, very few of us actually have been reading. So our brains have not had time to evolve for reading. There is no reading part of the brain. There's no Broca's area for reading. And so when we read, we are rewiring parts of our brains that were designed evolutionarily for other things and putting them in purpose, putting them in service of reading. And so it's what Dylan Williams calls biologically secondary, as opposed to biologically primary, things we can learn through intuition. It requires deliberate instruction. It requires methodology. And so I can see why someone would make the mistake. It's logical to say, reading and language acquisition would happen the same way. But actually, we now know that they don't happen the same way, that reading involves complex cognitive processes that don't yield themselves to the mere observation of intelligent people, and that we have to respect the science and understand the science. And just to go back briefly to our book, interestingly, is not about phonics. it's about trying to extrapolate the lesson. The lesson is that we spent 20 years miseducating young people about how to learn to read in the early elementary years because we ignored the science when it was available to us. If you look at the data right now on how we learn to read in grades 3 through 12, even through, the data is also terrible. A great school can close the gap between people, kids who grow up in poverty and kids who grow up in privilege in math in 2 to 3 years. Those same schools often never close the gap in reading. The same lesson that there's a science of reading that can tell us how to teach reading in grades 3 to 12 also applies. We have also been slow to respond to it, to recognize it, to see it. And it often causes us to question our intuitions and the way that we've done things for a long time. And that is a big ask, and people are resistant to it. And so the change has been tragically slow and the price has been high.
Yeah, this book is not about how to learn how to sound out words and then be able to pronounce them correctly. This book is, what I love about it is that it's about how to think about reading when you're teaching people how to understand and assimilate and absorb a text, a written text. And that is a special art. I don't know how scientific it is, but I think there are things we know from studies about it. And we also know a little bit from our own experience, which is understandably somewhat dangerous. But
experience is not irrelevant. It just needs to be combined with an understanding of cognitive science.
But a profound example that you hit on quite repeatedly in the book is the importance of background knowledge. Why is it important? What do you mean by background knowledge being crucial for reading fluency, which is a very different level than just being able to read?
Yeah. I think one of the fundamental beliefs of the American teaching of reading is that reading is made up of a set of transferable skills. For example, making an inference from a text. And so the way that American schools typically approach this is we would practice making inferences, and we might talk about what an inference is. And Russ, when you're making an inference, and an inference is you're filling in the blanks between what the author said and what the author meant. And so we might have a little chant that we'd say we'd talk about the 7 steps to make an inference, and we'd talk about making an inference. And unfortunately, it's a beautiful idea to imagine that if we taught someone to make an inference or to determine the main idea of a passage, that they would be able to take that skill and apply it to any text that they read for the rest of their lives. Right? Let's just close our eyes for a minute and imagine how beautiful that would be if I could teach you to make any inference from any text that you ever read. The problem is that making inferences is domain specific. It's based on your background knowledge. I have an example first of all, the key study on this is really fascinating. It's Recht and Leslie's baseball study. So they have a passage that they give students to read about baseball. And this is, by the way, this is great fun to do with audiences in England, because if you give them a very simple passage about baseball, Roberts was on second, Lemov bunted him, laid down a sacrifice for the first out in the inning, or let's say I'm the pitcher and something, Lemov walked the number 9 hitter on 4 pitches, and Roberts, the manager, signaled to the bullpen without even walking to the mound, right? That's a better example, right? That's a story that if you have background knowledge about baseball, you know that you should never walk the number 9 hitter, and that signaling to the bullpen without walking out to the mound is a gesture of disrespect and frustration to the pitcher. You show that passage to someone in England who knows nothing about baseball, and they're like, "What? Huh? There's tension between Roberts and Lemov. There's disrespect." They have no idea, because the background knowledge causes you to make an inference. I get a simpler example of this is every text causes you to have to disambiguate the text, and you disambiguate based on your background knowledge. So in the book, I offer this sentence: the wooden box was heavy. She put her bear down. It was going to be hard to carry. Right? Tell me about that. Tell me about that story. Who's the main character? What's happening in that story?
So that's a little girl, and she's got to pick up a wooden box. It might not be a big box because she's probably a little girl, And we know she's a little girl because she's carrying a bear, and it's probably not a grizzly. It's a stuffed animal. And it's hard, this whole idea of putting something down to pick something up.
Yeah.
For you and me, it'd be easy. We just grab the box, but she's small, her hands are small. So we got a whole visual story from those two sentences.
You created a story, invested it with meaning, made inferences about it based on your background knowledge, right? That like she could not have been carrying a real bear because the weights and sizes of things is impossible.
And if she would die.
Yeah, if it's a toy bear, we have to be talking about a child. Like that is actually a big inference about this story. Who is she? She is a child. The bear is a toy bear. Even the third sentence is, it was going to be hard to carry. The pronoun it could actually refer to the bear or the box. Yeah. But you knew intuitively that it had to be the box because the box is heavy and the bear is easy. The bear would not be heavy. So you disambiguated that text based on your background knowledge. It's a very simplistic example of background knowledge. The baseball example is a much more complex example of background knowledge. But essentially what the science tells us is that our order thinking is domain specific. We make inferences. We think deeply about things that we know a lot about. Quick, Russ, make an inference about particle physics. What is your insight about whether Napoleon should have attacked on the second morning of the Battle of Waterloo? Go, right? You can't. Well, you might know. You might actually know.
I wrote an incredible study of the Battle of Waterloo when I was 8 years old. And for a long time, I had that study. What's really funny about that, just as an aside, is I remember writing that paper. I remember my handwriting for that paper. And I remember taking it to my dad, who knew history very well, and assuming he would be able to read what I had written and tell me, Grand Marshal Ney, N-E-Y, Grand Marshal Ney, he wasn't on the sunken road of Ohain or whatever it was called. And I knew to me, it was just a bunch of facts that my background knowledge was mediocre, but my dad, of course, would know why the Battle of Waterloo was lost because he's a grown-up and he reads history. Yeah. I didn't understand at the age of 8 I might have been 10. I didn't understand then that history is ambiguous and difficult. But so go ahead. Sorry.
No, it's I asked the wrong guy the Waterloo question, obviously.
Well, I still understand it, man. It's the sunken road was key.
Did you have any 10-year-old papers you wrote as a 10-year-old on particle physics to really blow up my arguments?
No, no, you're good.
So this is you actually demonstrated quite a few things. So first of all, that the inference happens because you have the background knowledge, and there's a curse of knowledge, which is when you know something about the Battle of Waterloo, it's very hard to glimpse and understand the things that someone doesn't understand, to even know the things that they don't understand, never mind why they don't understand them. And so one of the things we argue is that it's a tremendous waste of time to spend time practicing making inferences. We make inferences when we have background knowledge. If we want students to learn more from text, we should provide them with rich and useful and interesting background knowledge while they're reading the book. I made a horrible mistake as a parent. When my son was in 7th grade, I gave him Animal Farm to read. And I didn't give him a lot of background knowledge. And I didn't tell him anything about the Russian Revolution and about how this is an allegory for this. So he, read the book diligently. He was a pretty good reader. And he was like, this is a really great story about talking animals on a farm. And this happens all the time. For some reason, I think this is a funny story. I have an aunt who likes to write letters of complaint to product manufacturers. She had a bowl of Campbell's chicken soup, which she wrote a letter of complaint. And she said, if there was ever a chicken in this soup, it walked through with its boots on. And actually, I think that is a really good analogy for how students experience the books that we read, especially historical fiction. They walk through with their boots on. We're assuming that they're learning about, if it's Number the Stars, classic canonical, 5th or 6th grade text set in Denmark during World War II, during the Nazi occupation. And we assume that kids are learning about, they don't have enough background knowledge to understand what rationing is and why there's rationing and why people would be constrained from telling the truth and why activities are clandestine and what the risks are to Jewish citizens, right? They're walking through with their boots on because they don't have the background knowledge. And if we want them to think more deeply about the text and want them to make more inferences about the text and want them to remember more about the text, the thing to do is to give them knowledge, often through short nonfiction articles. Let's read an article about rationing and talk about why there was no butter and no sugar and why there's rationing. And let's talk about, let's understand some things. The other thing about this is that it levels the playing field, because so often there's some students in the classroom who do know a little bit about the occupation and Nazi, in World War II and Nazi Germany. And so they can engage the text, but half the class doesn't know those things. And so suddenly we're like, well, what do asking them to make inferences about things where they don't have background knowledge, they're not able to play, and they very quickly learn that reading is not for me because I can't participate in the conversations about the book.
I mean, the other powerful insight, economists call it opportunity cost. The other powerful insight is that I'm thinking about my example of Grand Marshal Ney. Now, when you hear Grand Marshal Ney, first of all, Ney is not a normal modern, say, American name. You might think Ney, does that mean negative? Does that mean a horse? And you don't know what a Grand Marshal is. And I think that's the correct name for the French army. I'm not 100% sure. But if I ask the students, what do you think a Grand Marshal is? Well, they might think it has something to do with a parade, a marshal for a parade. They might think it's a sheriff in the West. They might think it's Grand Master, might have something to do with chess. And you point out in the book that as you're trying to guess, as students are, they're at sea, they're desperately trying to grab onto this. The idea that by trying, they will get better at it is false. That's number one. But the second deep insight is that this is the opportunity cost. That takes a lot of time, and it has little benefit. But by taking up a lot of time, you've lost the opportunity to do other things. And the idea of having a brief excerpt or a passage about, say, rationing or what World War II was like in occupied countries is unbelievably powerful, because not only does it shorten the amount of time spent guessing, which has little benefit, it might apply to other readings and other examples that are going to come later.
I'm building your background knowledge. Both reading the nonfiction builds my background knowledge, but it also causes me to learn more from the fiction. And maybe reading the fiction causes me to be more interested in the nonfiction and more engaged in it. And so I'm building student knowledge as we go. And you also, I just want to draw a line under something that you said that's really profoundly important, which is guessing is not critical thinking. And a lot of people mistake it. And the place where we see this most is in the teaching of vocabulary. I'd say, you gave the example of Grand Marshal, right? You could argue that this is a vocabulary word, like marshal. What does it mean? Vocabulary is the single most important form of background knowledge that we have. You almost can't conceive of an idea unless you have a word for it. And often the way that teachers are socialized to teach vocabulary is to have students, well, they would call it critical thinking. Guess what? So the boys' hands were tired and raw when, exhilarated, they reached the top of the mountain, right? So, or the boys were, the boys' legs were tired, their hands were raw when, exhilarated, they reached the top of the mountain. If I asked you in a typical American vocabulary lesson, we would then guess what the word exhilarated meant there. And I might ask, say, does anyone know the word exhilarated from their experience? Right? Maybe half the class knows a little bit about it. Half the class knows nothing. Or I might say, from the context clue in the sentence, what can the context clues tell you about the word exhilarated? If I asked you to come up with a synonym from that for what exhilarated means, and you didn't know what exhilarated meant, what would you guess?
Well, you might mean exhausted, because it sounds kind of like it. You might get confused and make that error.
Yeah, and interestingly, the context clues are misdirective, right? They actually tell us the wrong definition of exhilarated. Often, sometimes they're directive, but actually when the word is most important in the sentence, the context clues are least likely to be useful. In this case, the whole sentence pivots around the idea that you would expect them to be exhausted. They're tired and raw and worn out, but they're exhilarated because something's changed, because they've reached the top, right? And so this idea of inferring word meaning from context clues is flawed. But what teachers think that they're doing is they think they're teaching critical thinking. They think that the guessing here, students guessing at the word exhilarated, is critical thinking, when it's not. And a much better strategy would be to say something like, exhilarated means excited and made alive by a challenging experience. Why might they feel exhilarated when they reach the top of the cliff? Go. Turn and talk to your partner. 15 seconds. Go. What's a time when you might feel exhilarated, but not because of physical effort, but for some other reason? 15 seconds. Go. What's a time in your life when you felt exhilarated recently, and why was it so important to you? 15 seconds. Go. There, I'm starting with the definitions. The first thing I do, I start with the background knowledge, and then I ask you to apply it in different situations, in different settings. That really is critical thinking, right? First the knowledge, then the critical thinking. If I try and do the critical thinking to arrive at the knowledge, what I have is guessing. And the other thing about it is that if I give the knowledge first, everyone in the room can play. Everyone has a definition of exhilarated, and now they're trying to use it in different settings and thinking about it and encoding it in their long-term memory. If I ask you to try and guess at the word exhilarated, half the kids in the room are like, I've never heard that word. I don't know what it means. And no thank you on vocabulary.
And as you point out, often the whole point of that unusual word is to grab the reader and make them appreciate that even though their hands were raw and they're really tired, they're actually happy, not depressed, say, or whatever other state you might guess at. But the other part that I loved, and this is, as someone struggling to learn a foreign language now in Israel, you'd think that when you hear it and you go, exhilarated, that's a good word. I'm going to try really hard to remember it. Exhilarated means really happy after a challenge, or really happy and feeling exultantly alive. And I think about it. And it turns out the next day when you see exhilarated, you got to look it up in the Hebrew English dictionary again. And you think, why can't I remember anything? And the answer is because that technique is not the way we remember things other than short term.
We need lots and lots of retrieval practice, right? That we forget almost everything that we learn in life. And that, we have to, this is just a basic thing. One of the most established concepts in cognitive science is that learning is defined as a change in long-term memory. And if I want to make a change in long-term memory, I have to bring things back into conscious thinking, back into working memory after a period of forgetting. So the next lesson has to start with like, okay, Russ, what's the word for exhilarated again? Let's just review that. I have to do that 3 or 4 times to encode it in long-term memory so you can find it.
Even that, repeating the definition is not nearly as powerful as you asking me to come up with an example from my life when I was exhilarated. That's so deep. I mean, it's not, it shouldn't be, but it is.
Well, so there are 2 reasons why I would say that is true. One is the cognitive scientist Hector Ruiz Martin describes encoding, which is learning something, going from understanding it to building it into our long-term memory, as thinking hard about the meaning of the learning object and connecting it to other things in your long-term memory. So what interested you about that is like, okay, a time in my life when I've been exhilarated, then I'm both retrieving exhilarated, but then connecting it to an experience that was important to me. And then when I asked you to think of what's an example, why might the boys be exhilarated here, right? You have to explain it based on the context of the sentence. And then what's a time when you might be exhilarated that didn't involve physical activity? Oh, I was exhilarated when I achieved, I got a high grade in a test in school. That's causing you to engage different applications, different shades of meaning. And so you have, the research on vocabulary is that students who have the best vocabulary and have the best reading comprehension don't just know more words, they know words more deeply, right? The depth of word knowledge and breadth of word knowledge are different things, and we have to teach both. And so this sort of model of vocabulary that we propose, which is instead of wasting your time trying to guess the definition, and the definition is the end point of vocabulary study, the definition is the starting point. And then we can do lots of examples, what we call active practice, which can be playful and fun and funny, but it causes me to think about the word in different ways, in different contexts, in different settings. So I get depth of word meaning, and I get lots and lots and lots of retrieval, right? If we have a good conversation about this word, I could probably cause you to use the word exhilarated 20 times in the space of, a couple of minutes, and then you own it, but you own it deeply. You understand it from a reading perspective.
Well, and the part I love about it is, exhilarated just means happy. So it's just a fancy word for happy. Now, in fact, it's not. It actually has I would say, exhilarated means it makes something that makes your heart sing, which is an interesting phrase in and of itself because your heart doesn't sing. But lousy vocabulary and mediocre acquisition of reading and vocabulary is, oh, I have a synonym for that, happy. The depth that you're talking about is starting to think about the nuance of why a great writer might say exhilarated rather than happy, or satisfied, because it's more than just happy and it's more than just satisfied.
From a reading comprehension perspective, if two words overlap in meaning by 80, so this is the second most common way that vocabulary is taught in American schools is the synonym model, right? Yeah. Imitate means mimic. And those words, maybe they overlap 80% in their meaning, imitate and mimic. But if I say, Doug imitated Russ's speaking style versus Doug mimicked Russ's speaking style, right? Like the differences between those two words, one of them could be respectful and appreciative, and one of them is mocking, right? It's the differences between those two words that would create the meaning in a text. If we read that in a text, right? If I teach a word as a synonym, I teach students to, the risk is that we miss the 20% of the words that are different, that create the real nuance and that create the understanding when we're reading text. And so I think this is why the research on word depth is that depth of word knowledge is important as breadth of word knowledge. But the way that, I think the point here is that the way that we teach vocabulary underestimates its importance, treats it mostly as a skill, and rather than a critical form of background knowledge, and results in students whose reading isn't what it could be.
And just to add another footnote about translation, learning a new language, it's very common. You go to Google Translate and you say, what does this Hebrew word mean in English? And of course, it gives you one word usually. If you work at it, you can get 12, but in general, it gives you a word. So you think, well, now I understand it. And you do at a certain level, but it's why it's hard to be an immigrant, because there's a nuance of the native speaker that you will never acquire unless, you're extremely gifted or come at a young age. And when we're talking, you and I in this conversation, you're translating what I'm saying into your language in your head. And I'm hoping that you're getting my nuance. And I think we're pretty good at it, but it's why miscommunication takes place even when we speak the same language. And reading is an attempt to understand a thoughtful person's nuance and to grasp it. And it's an art.
For sure. When you were telling that story, I was thinking of my parents had a friend who was from Italy who immigrated. He married an American woman, moved to the U.S., and he said the hardest part was his English was good, but he said it was so hard to be funny in English because because he knew the words mostly, but he couldn't choose exactly the right word with a little sense of irony to drop in there. And so it was almost like his whole personality changed as a result.
Yeah, it's a cliche that humor is hard to translate, but that's true when you think about the difference between a great comedian and an okay comedian, or a great punchline and a non-punchline. You can take the greatest punchline to a joke, and if you use a different wording, which means the same thing, I mean, come on, but it doesn't. You don't get the same humor. Let's shift gears. I want to talk about whole books. You emphasize reading for young people, but I would add for adults mostly too, that we should read whole books in a group, in a classroom for students, in the case of students. And I would say for adults, there's something powerful about a book club where a group of adults read a book together. Why? Why whole books and why in a group?
Yeah, and this is a profoundly important. You wouldn't think this would be an important argument unless you had spent a lot of time in schools and you had seen how rarely students read books anymore and how often they read passages and excerpts and short pieces. But several things happen when we read books that make them the optimal form of learning communication. One is that the medium is the message, and a book is a long form process of understanding an idea with complexity and depth. In comparison, say, to a tweet, which suggests that the world can be understood in 128 character implements simply and easily via a hot take. I just finished reading Ian McEwan's book, Atonement. the first 60 pages of it, like I didn't really, someone recommended it to me. I didn't really like it. It kind of started slowly. And then over time, I started to understand the whole context and milieu of like the argument that was making and what had happened and why the characters did what they did. And I started to understand some version of truth that was deeper than I would have been able to understand if I hadn't gone through that process. I think that one of the interesting things about a book is that the protagonist never believes at the end what they did at the beginning, right? Their thinking changes, and a book takes you through the process of deep understanding and change. And it is beneficial. And so that was a profound part of my reading this book. But the struggle of like, I'm not sure I like this, that I had to discipline myself to read 60 pages until I got into the book, and then to have found in the end that I'm so grateful that I've read it because it changed the way that I thought. Learning that over and over again, discipline of thinking, the way that thinking responds to sustained inquiry, is a really important lesson, especially in an era when, you know, the message to young people, to all of us, is that I can pretty much understand this deeply complex issue in the span of a tweet. I think that's one reason.
I could just get ChatGPT to
Sure.
summarize it for me, and then I know what's in the book.
I think there are other reasons. I think the other reason, a couple of other reasons why books are profoundly important. First of all, there's a lot of research that stories are cognitively privileged, that we remember things best when we experience them in a story. I think there are evolutionary reasons for this, right? Like if you think about an early human, it is necessary to our survival to know how to hunt and know how to create a fire. But unlike every other animal, we don't learn how to do this through instincts, right? We have to be taught it and explained it by other humans. And the way that we, for most of our history, communicated this is we sat around campfires, we sat around in groups, and we told the story of the hunt to each other. Or we told the story of like how we built a fire and it was incredibly hard to do. And, you know, how we overcame that. And so the people who listened to those stories, before there was writing, this is how we communicated our culture, who we were, but also how to survive, cumulative capital. We're the only species on the planet that can communicate complex ideas that are more than you, that are multi-step, that you are greater than you can hold in working memory at any given time. So there's a double selection advantage conferred evolutionarily on the people who listen to stories, right? One, you learned how to hunt as a group and how to start a fire, but also by listening to the stories together, like we're bonded and we're connected, and there's this like group formation. I think one of the least understood parts of our evolutionary story is that, you know, we only survived in groups, that a human by him or herself on the savannah with a big brain and an opposable thumb is toast. And is going to be in some fitter creature's belly by midday because you can't smell your enemies from a mile away and you don't have night vision. And even compared to one of those really cute chimpanzees, you don't have claws and you don't have fangs. You don't have a chance in a fight against that animal. Only when we formed groups and learned that we could rely on each other. Like, interestingly, throwing rocks was one of the critical points of inflection in human prehistory. We're the only species on the planet that can attack or defend from a distance by throwing projectiles. And so if we can all rely on each other completely to stand and throw rocks, we can drive away a lion or hunt a lion. And so group formation, we survive in groups, and the people who were unable to form groups or assure their membership in the group or meet the norms of the groups, they were exiled and they perished. And we are the heirs to the group formers. So stories are cognitively privileged to us because they confer a double advantage on us, right? We learn things through stories, and we were bonded in the experience of like listening to stories together. So we have evolved to like prize stories and give special importance to stories and remember the things that we learned from stories for a variety of reasons. So a story especially a story that we're emotionally and psychologically committed to, is learning optimal. And a book captures that. And a book models the sort of persistence that is needed to master complex ideas. And it suggests that ideas are complex and not simple and require a sustained study to truly understand the world. And lastly, books contain cultural capital, which is profoundly important ideas that reflect the accumulated wisdom of society. Almost everything that's in most important to society has been written and captured in books. And if I know those books and I have access to them, then I can connect to people about, if you refer to Shakespeare or to 1984, if I don't know anything about George Orwell in 1984, I can't even have a conversation with you about those things. And maybe if I could just say one more thing about particularly reading books that are older than 50 years old. So one of the most important forms of diversity that I think is available to us is to hear the voices of the past in their own words as they thought it, and to understand that we have a very presentist way of believing, thinking about human consciousness, and to understand the most important form of diversity, you could argue, is the way people thought about things 100, 200 years ago, that they felt much more connected to place, that they had a strong sense of duty, that they, went off and fought and died in wars, that they were much more connected to death and dying, that their family members died with shocking regularity. That, yes, they also they made clearer and, by our perspective, less defensible judgments about race and culture. Like, understanding all those things about the way that people thought in the past helps us to understand ourselves in the present. If we don't understand those things and we haven't heard the voices of the past, we have a very simplistic view of our own context and milieu today. And I think you see this all the time with young people having this very presentist, simplistic views of human nature and human history.
That was lovely. I just want to add one thing. It's a common theme for listeners of the program, but I want to say it again because it's so important. Summaries are not, we don't read fiction. We don't even read nonfiction for the facts. At one point on this program a few years ago, we were talking about something of Homer, either the Iliad or the Odyssey, and someone said, I don't need to read it. I read the classic comic. And there is no classic comic for Atonement by Ian McEwan. If there were, you would not be changed by that. Knowing what happens in the book is not why it's a good book. It's not why it's powerful. And sharing the intellectual journey of a great author in nonfiction, for example, is more than just, here's a bunch of facts you're going to enjoy knowing. It's, here's my story, even though it's nonfiction. Here's my story of how these facts go together and why they matter. And you do that 100 times with great minds, and you become wiser. And that cannot be summarized. It can't be put in a tweet. It can't be put in a AI summary. It can't be put into a classic comic. And it can't be put in a movie, although a movie is a different thing, and it can be very powerful. The transformative effect of a great book is the struggle and the simulation that you make, as you write about in your book, of putting yourself in the shoes of the different characters and feeling how they change. And that only comes through a sustained and long reading. And that takes work. It's not so popular these days, and your defense of it is very eloquent. And I think I like to think it will have the pendulum will swing back. I may be wrong. I didn't say I'd be right. I said I'd like to think. I hope I'm right. But
can I say one tiny thing about that?
Yeah, sure.
I agree with you so strongly. And I think that a lot, you mentioned that the book is for educators, but it's also for parents and it's for policy makers, hopefully. And I think that a lot of parents would probably not realize just how few and far between books are in schools and how much they've been cast out or driven out of the student experience. There's a viral story on social media about a student at Columbia University who her professor asked her to read several books, and she went to him and was, surprised and felt like it was unfair because she'd never had to read a book cover to cover in high school and getting to Columbia University. I don't know if you saw this article. This is not an anomaly, right? Student attention has been changed by the advent of the smartphone and social media, right? One thing we know about our attention, our ability to sustain states of concentration and focus, is that it's malleable. And that if you spend a significant part of your life, 5 to 6 hours a day, if you're the average American teenager, in a state where there's constant novel stimulation, you come to require, you don't even need your cell phone anymore to require that state. The state is wired within you. As it gets harder, so students read less and less outside of school, and it's harder and harder to get them to sustain the states of concentration in school. And so I think a lot of schools have given up on requiring students to do things that are hard and challenging, that they no longer have the cognitive wherewithal to do. But ironically, the greatest gift that they can give young people is to cause them to read those books, and to actually, we argue in the book, to rebuild their attentional capacity. But if the cell phone has taught us that attention is malleable, we should get all the screens out of our classrooms, and we should give kids books. And we should ask them to read for 5 minutes straight, and then 8 minutes straight, and then 10 minutes straight. Ideally, this would be like reading aloud together, so there's a social factor to it, and then 12 minutes together. That we wire how we fire, right? That we read the way we practice reading. We will read the way we practice reading. I tell the story of a teenager who required to read for 45 minutes a day. It might or might not be my son when he was a teenager, lying on his back on the couch, reading the same book that I read 30 years beforehand. But when he reads it, every 5 seconds, bzz, dude, over at Byron's, you coming over soon? Bzz, dude, what's the math homework? Bzz, dude, that girl in your math class, when are you going to ask her out? Like, his experience with the book is fractured. He doesn't sustain the state of attention. He's not as connected to the book because it's constantly, and he's not in the place where the book is. That it's not just that students read less, it's just they read differently and fractured and disconnectedly. And we can accept that, or schools can say, we need to rebuild. We can participate in rebuilding your attentional state. And this is one of the greatest gifts we can give you, to cause you to read for 10 minutes unbroken. And that capacity will serve you for the rest of your life. And this is one of the arguments that we make in the book, that changes in attention and changes in reading habits are one of the least acknowledged factors in literacy instruction. Students simply do not read. For many of the students in our schools, the books that we assign in school will be the only books that they read meaningfully in their youth. Sorry, it's sadly true. The book is in a death struggle against the cell phone, and unless we bring it to life in our classrooms, and unless we make it social, we read together, and I feel connected to people by reading a book together, it's going to lose.
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons I recommend book clubs. I'm reading For Whom the Bell Tolls by Hemingway, which I read 50 years ago for the first time, and now I'm rereading it. And I have no interest in rereading. And I should just say, for the record, if you had said to me, "Hey, what's your next book going to be? How about For Whom the Bell Tolls?" I'd say, "No, thank you." But because my son had read it and praised it, I thought, okay, I'm going to read it again. It's magnificent. I'm thrilled at how much I enjoy it, but I'm reading it differently because I'm both reading it through his eyes, and I'm reading it in a way, I'm ashamed to tell you, Doug, I'm reading it on my phone. I have a hard copy over there that I read sometimes, but if I'm out, I read it on my phone. But that allows me to capture a screenshot, share it with my son, and say, notice how he uses this little detail. And it's been incredibly fun. I want to add one more footnote to our discussion about the power of reading an entire book, and then I want to shift gears to close with a different topic. Middlemarch is one of my favorite novels. I read it 45 years ago, probably. And the last page of Middlemarch is a masterpiece. Now, if I gave it to you and said, Doug, let me read this out loud, you're going to like this. Or here it is, you read it to yourself. You'd go, wow, it's good. I like it. And that's nice. When it comes after the hours of experience you've had with the characters, it's overwhelming. You could weep, and you might at the ending. And it's just, some things are hard and worth it. So to all listeners out there, continue to read.
Can I just go back for 1 second?
Sure.
you were saying something that I think is really important about book clubs and about sharing the experience of reading For Whom the Bell Tolls with your son, that I think we underestimate how social reading is or can be. I think it's interesting in an era when generally reading behaviors are diminishing massively. The book club has become more popular than ever.
Yeah.
That there is something profoundly powerful about reading the story together with other people and sharing your experience, either having read it on your own and talking about it, or even reading it together live and like we're gasping together or we're laughing together. And suddenly I feel connected. It reminds me of, a couple of my kids were home from school for vacation, and we're watching a family movie, all of us in the living room in the semi-dark. And every time there was like a funny scene, I was struck by how often like I would turn to look at them and see are they laughing too? Are they having the same like experience? Like why would I do that? It's a very strange behavior, because the story is more meaningful for all the reasons I think of, like, evolutionarily and how important the story is more meaningful if I see that you appreciate it too and we're connected by it. And if we read a book aloud in class together, and we're laughing and we're experiencing it together in a similar way, one, I can curate the experience so that we read for an extensive period. We read for 10 minutes, maybe we read 5 minutes together and then you read 5 minutes on your own. But those moments when we laugh together or we gasp together are actually, they connect us to other people through the text. They make the text social. And I think that if books are very, very important. And if books have a hope in their death struggle against the cell phone, it will be, interestingly, by making them more social, more by using them as a tool for connection. And that, like, what should we do with the 45 minutes that we're not going to spend describing the 7 steps to making an inference or finding the main idea? We should actually read aloud together in class. We should read for 10 minutes. I should give you a little nonfiction article about like the scene that's coming up and how, like, resistance movements in Denmark. Then we should read aloud together. And like, I should hear you expressively reading and be like, wow, Russ is really into this book. That's so cool. Maybe I'll read it expressively too. And, but we'll have a shared experience. That is where stories started. And I think that your experience of like book clubs and like wanting to send sections of the book to your son does tell us that reading is and can be much more social than it is. And it's probably the book's best hope.
Yeah, I would just tell parents, don't say, this is the best part coming up, which I'm prone to do, but I try to restrain myself. Yep. What I wanted to shift to is your own personal reading habits. You just said you've been reading Atonement by Ian McEwan, which I didn't particularly like, I'll just confess. And I despise the movie, just for the record. But what do you read for pleasure? And do you reread? Do you go back and read books like For Whom the Bell Tolls Again? And
I find I love rereading. Like, I don't think I've read 1984 since I was assigned it as a student, but I read it this year and I was like, my God, every student should read this. It's brilliant. It's incredible. I read a lot. It's interesting. I read mostly nonfiction. I love reading nonfiction. But recently I've forced myself to read some fiction, and I'm not forced myself. I've reconnected myself with fiction, and I've been stunned by how meaningful it is and how much I take from it. I try to read voraciously. I notice even in myself my lack of stamina and my lack of focus and how easily distracted I am and how many fewer books I read and how I sit down to read with a book and my phone is there and suddenly I'm practicing my Spanish or suddenly I'm on Twitter. So I think that's what I fear for our students. I also experience for myself. And I think most people probably do also. The one thing that I would say that I have useful to say about reading habits is that I have a bookshelf in my office, my home office. I'm at work right now, where I keep books that I've read that have been profoundly meaningful to me. It's on a little shelf. And I walked by that shelf the other day and I looked at one of the books and I was like, I remember loving that book. What's the protagonist's name again? Couldn't remember. What happens in the book? Couldn't remember. I can remember the setting. It's set, I can remember the country that it's set in, and I can remember one line that I wrote in my journal from the book. It's all gone, right? That thinking deeply, understanding is not learning, that it has to be encoded in long-term memory for me to learn. But one of the things that I've done, I keep a little reader's journal now. And when I read a book, I'm always underlining. I think it's really important to direct your attention and focus your attention to annotate when you're reading. It's why it's so important, I think, mostly for students to read in hard copy. But when I finish reading a book, I make myself go back through, and all the passages I've starred, I force myself to handwrite them into a little journal. Maybe 10 or 15 things. I did this with your book about Adam Smith. It was great. But now it helps me, now I find that I remember more than just that I love the book. I remember things, I remember lines from the book, I remember scenes from the book, I remember arguments, and it's helped me to make my reading life much more useful. Just understanding the cognitive science myself, which is that learning is a change in long-term memory. As one cognitive scientist says, if nothing has changed in long-term memory, nothing has been learned. There's a whole chapter in the book about writing and how important writing is to reading, but one of the things that writing does is to write it down causes us to think hard about the meaning of the learning object, and you're more likely to remember it. And that's really changed my life as a reader.
I just want to tell a story. It fits in with what we're talking about. When I was in college, before I went to college, I liked Joseph Conrad, and I liked. I think I'd read. Can't remember which I'd read. I think it was Lord Jim. Not sure, but anyway, I liked Conrad, and there was an English course on Conrad, and I was excited, but it was Conrad and Faulkner, and I hated Faulkner. I was a snob. My dad didn't like Faulkner because he was obscure and hard to read. And my dad's a very direct writer, which I respect and have learned tremendously from over my career. But in those days, so I was very disparaging of Faulkner's opaque style, having tried to read The Sound of the Fury at 16 and not getting very far and thinking, well, it's just a bad book.
It's tough sledding right there.
Yeah, very tough. It's a great example of ambiguous writing, like who's talking, what's happening, can't figure it out. So I put it down, think, well, he's overrated, and that's that. So, but I took the course, and I think the first Faulkner we read was As I Lay Dying. And As I Lay Dying is a book I recommend. Spoiler, I love Faulkner, became one of my favorite writers. And it wasn't so enamored of Conrad by the end of the course, but I read an immense amount of Faulkner in the course and then after. And when people say, how do you get into Faulkner? I say, well, read As I Lay Dying because it's somewhat accessible. But when I read it, I had to read it twice. It's short. It's a plus. But I actually know one line. I wish I'd kept a journal, but if I had, there's one line in that book that stuck with me, which I hope I'm going to get right. How often I have lain under rain on a strange roof thinking of home. And it's a book of many characters, but that character, I think it's Darrell, but I'm not 100%, but it doesn't matter. That line, how often have I lain under rain on a strange roof thinking of home? Obviously, there's a poetry in the rhyming of those three words, lain, rain, strange. But that line captures the alienation of the human experience in a magnificent way. And that's what I took from that book. I should reread it, but it's an amazing thing how those annotations can stick with you. But it's not the only reason. You don't just read fiction to learn things. You read fiction to experience things, to understand what other people go through. It's underrated in my view. Are you a better reader from thinking about it in a systematic way, the way you have for the books you've written on reading? Has it affected your own reading style?
Certainly affected my reading style. I think the biggest thing is, the sort of keeping a journal and realizing how much of what was meaningful and important to me I just forgot and lost. And I remember reading, I don't remember who's just talking. It was, I was reading the biography of someone in the 1920s or 1930s saying, I love this book. I've read it 3 times. I've almost mastered it. Like the idea that people used to read and try to master a book. I just became profoundly aware of how little I often took from these books that I would experience, and would know that there was something profoundly important that spoke to me in a way that no other medium thinking did, and that I lost most of it. So I do think that the cognitive science helped me there. It's certainly changed the way that I read and approach reading with my own children, and how important I think reading aloud with them and to them is, and how important I think vocabulary is. I think that one of the my mom was an editor, so growing up, she probably taught me to write. Every paper that I wrote for school, she would go through it and you'd be like, you called this interesting. You can't use the word interesting. You have to, in what way is it interesting? Challenge yourself to, but it taught me to take a pleasure in words and interest in words that I now see that words are never just words. Like, words encapsulate an idea in a unique way, and that you almost can't think of something unless you have a word for it. But when you have a word for it, suddenly it creeps into your consciousness. I have this very strange life where I spend 20% of my time working with professional sports franchises. I have a book on sports coaching. And in trying to learn basketball, to work with some basketball teams, I had to just learn the difference. I suddenly came on the difference between a step back three and a catch and shoot three. These are both three. These are different types of 3-pointers, and has to do with whether you receive a pass and shoot, or whether you're taken off the dribble and have to step back and shoot over a defender. And a step back three is much harder to hit than a catch and shoot three. It's much more elite skill. And just suddenly having the vocabulary word, the name for this, catch and shoot three versus step back three, I started to see the entire game differently. I would, all three-pointers were not all three-pointers to me. Suddenly, my entire watching experience, my understanding of the tactics, my understanding of ball movement, my ability to distinguish different types of shot, it totally changed the way that I watched the game of basketball just by having that slightly different word for things. And so I'd say one other takeaway from me is just, I think that that vocabulary is routinely underestimated, and I think it shapes how we perceive the world.
I learned that from your earlier books, that giving things a name allows you to have a conversation about it that you might not otherwise be able to have. It's not the word I would use is terminology. Mm-hmm. It's an aspect of vocabulary that enriches your ability to communicate about it. I think it's such a small thing, and I think it's so undervalued as a way to create a culture in an organization, for example, or in a school. It's a deep insight, which I learned from you. My guest today has been Doug Lemov. Doug, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Enjoyed it, Russ. Thanks for having me on.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.